Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company that I run alongside my colleague and friend, Dr. Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our May 2026 tour, Mary, Queen of Scots From Crown to Captivity, is an incredible week-long experience taking in many of the most iconic historical sites associated with Mary in her native Scotland, including Stirling Castle, Edinburgh Castle, a boat trip out to Loch Leven Castle, and even a fully privatised tour of the Palace of Holyrood House, plus much more. Featuring Dr. Anna Turnham as our historian in residence and featuring talks from noted historians including a keynote by Dr. Linda Porter, this tour will also feature some fun, thoroughly Scottish experiences, including a very nice whisky tasting evening that I am particularly excited about. We are now down to just a few spaces remaining on this tour, and so to discover more on this and secure your place on this or any of our other live tours, or to sign up to latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. It's the most wonderful time of the year, and so it was for the Tudors as well. Yes, it's Christmas, and so I thought it would be the ideal opportunity to examine how the Tudors spent the most festive time of year. To join me, I'm pleased to welcome back Tudor food and gardening historian Brigitte Webster onto the podcast. She and I examine how the Tudors decorated the home, from the poorest of subjects right up to the royal family. We look into some of the major foods popular across the Tudor period, explore some Christmas Tudor traditions, and also delve into what aspects of Tudor Christmas that are still very much part of how we celebrate it today. To the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 118, Christmas in Tudor England with Brigitte Webster. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast. Brigitte Webster, how are you?
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely fine. It's getting dark outside, so nice and cozy here and ready to share some Tudor spirit, Christmas spirit with you.
Yeah, this is going to be the final episode of 2025, and because of that, I wanted to do a Christmas special, and you instantly popped into my head as the perfect guest, given your extensive knowledge of how the Tudors lived and ate and drank and celebrated. Before we get into that discussion, can you just briefly introduce yourself and what it is that you now do full time?
Okay, yeah, I'd love to. Well, as you've already said, my name is Brigitte Webster. I am a food and garden historian who actually specialises in the Tudor period. And I generally focus on the 16th century, but I do sometimes venture either a bit more back or into the 17th century. Now, I live in a small, and I have to emphasize, small Tudor manor, which we are slowly preserving for the future. And I basically combine my practical and my academic qualifications in a way that I think I'm entitled to call myself the accomplished Tudor housewife in the 21st century. And I have, since last week, I have actually passed my MA in early modern England history with distinction. So I'm very proud of that.
Oh, well done. Congratulations. That's brilliant news. And I have had the distinct pleasure of coming to your Tudor manor house, and I can confirm it is a manor house, but it is not huge. And once you're inside, it actually feels quite contained when you're actually inside the house, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it reflects the home of a gentleman who belonged to the lower gentry. So he tried to do everything that he was meant to do to represent wealth, but on a small scale.
Yeah, well, it's beautiful, and the grounds that you've got at the house are also just so beautiful. So we're here, as I said, to talk about Christmas and how the Tudors celebrated Christmas. So to start with that, how long was the festive period celebrated during the Tudor times? You know, were there set things that would happen on certain days and so on, or is it quite similar to today?
Well, yes and no is the simple answer. The Christmas tide actually started much earlier, 40 years, which was then known as the 40 Days of St. Martin, and started on the 11th of November. We obviously know that time better as Advent. And to the Tudors, that was very much a time of spiritual penance and religious devotion. And it was, in fact, the main reason for a prolonged period of abstinence for which the Roman Catholic Church, so before Edward, forbade meat, cheese, milk and eggs during that time. And Christmas Day was indeed the first day where people were allowed to break that fast.
And was Christmas celebrated across all social classes in Tudor England?
Yeah, absolutely. Very much like today. It was all about excess food and fun. But, I believe that generally we are already quite well informed about how royalty and the upper class celebrated Christmas. So I thought I'd just quickly maybe tell you a little bit more about how the peasants and the poorer people in society celebrated Christmas, because it has been one of my personal interests. And so when we look at Christmas Day, for instance, we know that the wealthy mostly entertained family and social equals, because it was expected from them. But it was also a day of generosity. And the Lord of the Manor was actually expected to throw a feast for his neighbors, even his tenant farmers and laborers working on his estate. And that sounds all very fabulous, very much in the spirit of our time, share your wealth. But it's not quite so straightforward. The bizarre thing is, and it might appear a bit weird to us, is that the tenant guests were actually expected to bring gifts in form of farm produce or homemade pies. And so effectively, they brought their own food to this Christmas feast laid on by their Lord of the Manor. So to them, it was really about the privilege to dine in this impressive hall that mattered the most. It wasn't the food in itself, which to me sort of indicates that they ate well around Christmas themselves, but obviously it was the prestige being allowed to sit in the hall and dine there for Christmas. And we actually know quite a lot about how the lower society did celebrate Christmas because of the accountant books of the middle class. Those account books actually tell us quite into details what food was prepared for those tenant farmers and the people who came for such a feast and what they brought in return. And one of the most fabulous resources is actually the Willoughby family from Warwickshire and Nottinghamshire. They have provided us with the most fascinating insight into not just what they ate themselves at Christmas, but also what was served up to their servants and the tenants. But another person who I find very interesting when I do my own research is Thomas Tusser. Now, Thomas Tusser was an author of manuals for the working class, the farming community. And in his publication from 1557, he does give us a sort of hint that sometimes those Christian duties by the landlord were beginning to get forgotten, because there's one very short little rhyme which goes at Christmas be merry and thank God of all, and feast thy poor neighbours and great with the small. Ye all year long have an eye to the poor, and God shall send luck to keep open thy door. Now, I love that, because it does tell us that some would have opted out of their obligation to actually entertain their tenant farmers and the poorer in society.
Yes, that's very telling, isn't it, that little poem? And actually, you just mentioned, well, you just inspired me to ask something additional, which is you use the word feast. And I think a lot of people have this assumption, don't they, that when the Tudors ate on big style, they referred to it as a banquet, but that's not quite correct, is it?
Absolutely, spot on. There was a difference. The feast was what everybody invited would sit down to, and the feast, the sitting order at a feast was very strict according to your station in society. Also, once that feast finished and the furniture, like the tables and the seating arrangements, were taken away, you were then offered the void. Now, the void was basically a way to tell people, time to go home. Here is a glass of Hippocras and some wafers, and now go. And during the 16th century in England, we see a change, namely after that feast, certain privileged members of the feast were invited to join them for the banquet elsewhere, to start with in the building, but not in the hall. It was somewhere else. But very quickly throughout the 16th century, we see special banqueting towers built, or even houses somewhere in the garden, but it was away from the hall, and people were especially privileged to be invited to those. There was no specific seating order, so people could mingle and mix and talk to whoever they fancied. And you can imagine that was obviously very tempting, because you could choose who you wanted to talk to and maybe possibly fancy it. Who knows?
So Christmas was obviously, well, it is still a religious holiday. Obviously, the Tudors lived in a much more religious world than we do today. So how did this impact the way that they celebrated Christmas?
The festive period was pretty much the same before and during Christmas. But before the Reformation, Advent was taken very seriously. But as you can imagine, after the Reformation, so under Edward, this was considered more of a popish celebration. And so the fasting has definitely disappeared over a few years. And funny enough, it was under Henry VIII that some particularly Catholic customs like the boys bishop tradition were actively outlawed. So, yeah, definitely the 16th century is the century where you see certain things change, basically of that.
So obviously decorating the home has become a major part of identity of Christmas today. So did the Tudors also decorate their home during the festive period? And if so, how?
Yeah, they did, but not like we would picture it. What we know from John Stowe, for instance, who described life in London in particular, he wrote that apparently every man's house was bedecked with holly and ivy. And we do know that carrying evergreens into the house was held to bring good fortune. But doing it before Christmas Eve was definitely bad luck. So you wouldn't do it before Christmas Eve. And I stick with that. I think that's lovely. We also know that Elizabeth I paid for holly and ivy to deck the two churches next to Whitehall Palace each Christmas, which is quite interesting because it was... especially under Edward Christmas, church foliage had completely disappeared from the accounting books by the church. But Elizabeth reintroduced that for some churches. So she was a little bit conservative when it comes to that. But there is a 15th century poem which does clearly tell us about the use of the holly indoors and the ivy outdoors, which is quite significant. It has a significant, interesting reason behind it.
And what were those reasons? I mean, were there other types of tree and plant used as well?
Yeah. So let's start with the holly. The holly was the symbol of Christ's crown of thorns and therefore was used to decorate churches in particular. And funny enough, the Brickley holly was considered male, where the smooth-edged one female. And we obviously know that Shakespeare also uses holly in his work. I think, it was As You Like It. But ivy was used to decorate the front door, the porch, and also to adorn churches. And that's most likely because ivy was thought to protect against evil spirits and, in a way, disaster. And it was, funny enough, also a female plant. So you have the ivy outdoors to keep out the evil spirits, and you have the holly inside. And there's also bay or laurel, and there are some mentionings of rosemary as well. But they simply seem to have fallen out of use by the 18th century. So, they are less often referred to than the holly and the ivy.
And was this also the case for the poorer parts of society, or were they using other things that are more readily available, thinking pine cones and berries and things like that?
Anything green around Christmas was good to go inside. It was the color green that was important, and anything evergreen they could find was fine. The only thing you would not find is, funny enough, the mistletoe. Despite it being an ancient symbol of friendship and goodwill, the church wasn't so keen on it, let's put it that way. And they banned it due to the pagan connection to mistletoe. Also, the other thing they wouldn't use for decoration is yew, because yew was somehow connected with bad spirits, and later on there were links with witches using it. So no yew, but anything else green was fine.
And definitely no Christmas trees.
No, Christmas trees were definitely an introduction during the Victorian age, when Prince Albert brought the tradition from Germany.
So food is, of course, hugely important at Christmas now, and it's the thing you're most well known for being an expert in. So to start at the top, what sort of food would have been served at the royal court during Christmas?
Well, clearly, without any doubt, it was meat heavy. And at the very top, I would place the boar's head, probably one of the most iconic Christmas fare, and would not have been missed at any of the tables in royal places or the nobility. But it has been particularly associated with Queen's College in Oxford, where we know it was an established seasonal tradition since 1341. And second on that list would have to be venison. It was considered the most luxurious Christmas fare to the wealthy, and could be served either roasted or baked in a pie. But every fine household would have had that on the Christmas feasting table. It was also a very well-respected social marker. So if you served venison, you clearly owned or had legal access to a deer park, and that signaled to everybody around the table status, power, and your influence, and that mattered a lot. It was also quite conveniently provided in the hunting season, so it was the classic entertainment at Christmastide. Go hunting for your deer and then have it served up to your guests. But what I always find interesting about venison is that almost all physicians of that period regarded it slightly problematic, being the cause of depression and hot temper. But there was at least Andrew Board, the one physician we probably most know best. He still regarded it as still good for Englishmen and fit for a lord's dish. The third one on that list would have to be brawn. Now, brawn features a lot in contemporary descriptions about Christmas fare, and it's basically a rather salty pickled piece of boar or pork, and was always served with mustard, the Tudor equivalent to ketchup, and it was the most commonly eaten during winter, and yeah, not my favorite, I have to say. It's one of the Tudor dishes I would happily pass on. But all of those we just mentioned were generally served up with frumenti. And frumenti you will hear a lot if you deal in 16th century food documents. Frumenti keeps popping up. And what it was just basically boiled wheat or barley, sometimes in milk, ale, and then made a bit more interesting by adding eggs, dried fruit, spices, and sometimes sugar and cream. And that was the standard side dish to all the meats we just discussed.
So they weren't having sort of lots of winter vegetables like we would have today, like parsnip and carrot and things like that. That's later?
No, definitely not during the early Tudor period. Some might have come up during Elizabeth time, but they weren't mentioned. So they weren't important enough to be mentioned in any of the menus we still have access to.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, which is, were there any big changes in what was eaten at Christmas over the Tudor period, going from Henry VII through to Elizabeth? Are there things that we can clearly see where there was change?
16th century food supply was, as we know, seasonally very restricted. And so out of season fruit or vegetables like old apples were deemed very rare, and therefore you see them even used as gifts for Christmas from the public to somebody above their status. But generally, the Tudors were very good in preparing Christmas food, and it often started earlier in the summer, in the autumn, when they harvested the produce and preserved it ready for Christmas. The only exception was actually fish, funny enough, which sometimes came all the way from Iceland and the area, the fishing grounds there, preserved on the boats and then brought back. But otherwise, any changes, there's obviously turkey. Turkey does come in later, even though we know that turkey started to be talked about in polite society from about 1520. And we know it was sold, at least in London, from about 1530 onwards. It does not feature on the Christmas tables. We know that for sure. But it does sometimes pop up as part of Christmas gifts from one noble family to another. That is definitely the case.
I see, okay. And with that in mind, how did the Tudor, if we look at the royal family in particular, how would they have spent Christmas Day from a food perspective? You know, we today, most people, generally speaking, will sit down for Christmas lunch around 2:00, and then they'll spend the rest of the day just stuffing their faces with chocolate and everything. What did that look like for Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, for example? Was there a set time that they sat down for a Christmas feast with the court, or did they dine separately?
By the 16th century, even the royal family preferred generally to dine in a more private manner. So we see very few occasions where they actually dine with the public or with the court. For Christmas, it probably was a combination of both. We know that the exchange of presents happened on January the 1st. So they definitely must have made an appearance in the big hall to be celebrating with the rest of the court. But I still believe that their Christmas dinner they took in private, but it would have been around lunchtime, not earlier. Throughout the 16th century, people had only two major meals, especially the higher up you are in society. You would have only two, but very large meals, one late morning to midday, and the second one between 4 and 5. But, I am not a royal expert, so somebody who studies the royal family in more detail might be able to give us more details. But I can only observe what I know from other similar feasts and events.
Understood. Okay. And were there any foods that were utterly synonymous with Christmas? They only came out at Christmas, a bit like turkey is for us today and mince pies, for example.
Yes, of course. There was definitely the 12th cake or 12th night cake, which only came out at Christmas, but not on Christmas Day, but on the 12th night, which was the night before Epiphany, the 6th of January. And it was a kind of sweet bread with spices and dried fruit. But sadly, we do not have a single original recipe from that particular period. The earliest we have is actually by a lady called Eleanor Fettiplace, and her recipe for this type of fruitcake dates to 1647. And we obviously mustn't forget that in Tudor England, they did not have any raising agents except for yeast. So any cake would have been just kind of sweet bread. And then that obviously...
Sounds a bit like a panettone.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good comparison.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. And talking of mince pies, now, shoot me if I'm wrong, but I believe they were invented in Tudor England. Is that correct? That they have meat in them.
Well, some of it. Now, basically, the concept of mince pies, which is basically minced meat pies, dates back to medieval ages. They used generally veal or mutton mince and were not as small and compact as we know them today. They were actually proper-sized pies, mixed in with currants, prunes, candied orange peel, egg yolks, sometimes even fresh pears. But these were proper-sized meat pies. And it was only the Victorians that then completely dropped the meat content and reduced them to the size we know them today. What has also changed was that mince pies were only by the Tudors associated with Christmas, where before they weren't so much associated to Christmas in particular. That is what the Tudors did. They put them on the table at Christmas. And also, they were the first to replace what we know as a coffin crust. Now, the coffin crust was the non-edible cooking device, vessel basically made from just flour and hot water, which is, you can't eat it basically. And the Tudors decided, right, if you can't eat that, what's the point? Let's just add some egg and butter and hallelujah, all of a sudden you have a lovely pastry that you can eat. And that we also owe to the Tudors. So the Tudors made basically mince pies more enjoyable and put them on the Christmas menu.
I see. The coffin crust, is that what you, when you did that wonderful meal for us at your house, then you cooked the carp in pastry? Was that coffin pastry?
Yeah, and that's why we did not serve that up to you. Just the contents.
Yeah, because I remember having the carp, but not the
yes.
pastry. When people have asked me about carp afterwards, I always say it was a bit like mud. It's tasty, but there's a muddy quality to it.
It definitely has its own taste, doesn't it? It doesn't compare to any other fish. But in Tudor England, it was very much a status fish because it had only recently been introduced from the continent, and anything new was expensive, and if it was expensive, it had to be good. So you see it a lot on the feasting tables of the rich.
Were there any Tudor Christmas dishes that we still have today that are almost, that the Tudors would recognise, I suppose?
Yeah, there is the example of the plum pudding, which a lot of people would still be familiar with, but it started life as plum pottage. And as the name suggests, it was actually a broth, a thick broth made from mutton and beef, and had plums in it, a lot, but also bread and spices. And during Elizabeth's time, they started to add flour. And so you can see the consistency started to change. It was actually the Victorians, again, who completely got rid of the element of the meat and just used all the sweet fruit and the spices and made it into the pudding we know.
Another big thing that gets mentioned a lot is hippocras, and I've tried your hippocras. It was just delicious. It feels very similar to mulled wine today, which is quite a sort of staple of modern day Christmas. But hippocras, I think it wasn't just limited to Christmas for the Tudors. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Hippocras was a very popular spice drink made from wine. But funny enough, we do not know whether it was served hot or cold, which is interesting, isn't it? And most descriptions call for red wine, but I have found some late Elizabethan recipes that do mention white wine. And hippocras was basically used towards the end of a feast, and it goes back all the way to the medieval ages, so a very ancient drink, and we still drink it today. So I think, everybody should be familiar with hippocras.
Oh, it's so nice. I mean, we had it cold at your house, didn't we? And it was, I love mulled wine, so I knew I would like hippocras because I was advised that it's very, very similar. But I mean, is it similar, or am I just assuming it's similar?
It is. It definitely is. The only thing is, with mulled wine, we definitely serve it hot.
Yeah, of course.
Hippocras, we don't know, as I said. My gut feeling is that during the cold season, it was served hot, where in the summer or hotter season, like you did, it was enjoyed in cold form.
So what was wassailing?
How long have you got? I did a lot of research into wassailing because it seems to me there is quite a lot of misinformation out there based on sort of mix-ups that happened way back in the 17th century. Now, what we do know is the wassail drink was a communal drinking practice. And we are pretty certain it was a tradition that is believed to go back to Tudor times, possibly even further. And we also know that it has been enjoying a recent resurgence in modern England. But several Tudor documents refer to the custom of wassail as a warm spiced drink made from ale, not cider, okay? And it was being carried in a special wassailing bowl by the ladies of the house. And it seems to have been a practice taking part inside a house. And the best, or the very well-known description of that is by Henry Matchin, who in 1555 on 12th Eve witnessed this particularly lavish wassailing celebration at a party in Henley on the Thames. But this practice of taking the wassail bowl into the orchard, as we now believe it to be, on mostly Epiphany, doesn't seem to be as common as we might would want to think. In fact, a friend of mine, Dr. Joanna Crosby, she looked into this, and the earliest mention of this custom of the wassail drink to be carried into the orchard dates to January 1577, not before. And so I think, but I still need further research to prove it, I think it's quite possible that the tradition developed from this domestic carrying of this wassail bowl from the kitchen or wherever into the hall, developed into this tradition of taking it outside by possibly less higher ranking classes who just visited the bigger houses in hope of some food or money, or maybe to get a cup of wassail, and they took it into the orchard. And so it is a kind of jump from a posh domestic event to this jolly, all singing and dancing common affair in the orchard. But it is this jump. This is lost to us when exactly it happened. But it seems to be then that all of a sudden the drink changed from being ale-based to cider-based, and that then carries obviously the name lamb's wool, and no longer, strictly speaking, wassail drink.
Two things. So to summarize, it's a drink in a big pot that people pass around, basically.
Yes, the wassail pot.
So I've been meaning to ask you what lamb's wool is. So it's cider?
Yeah, it's a spiced cider. And as I was trying to explain, it seems to all of a sudden appear during the later years of the 16th century and right into the 17th century, when people were talking about this wassailing event taking place in the orchard. Then all of a sudden we have lamb's wool, which was made from cider, and even little apple pieces floating on top. Hence the word lamb's wool, because apparently it looked like wool swimming on top. I'm not convinced about that.
I was going to ask you, why is it called lamb's wool? So were there any Tudor Christmas traditions, like what was the Lord of Misrule, for example?
Right. The Lord of Misrule is basically that two people elected to be king and queen, and they decided what was played and when people danced and so on. But the interesting thing is, how were they selected? Was it just anybody? No. It all depended on what we know as the bean cake. Now, the bean cake is basically probably the oldest culinary Christmas tradition that we know of. But it's funny because in 1592, when Elizabeth went to Sudeley Castle, it had to be explained to her that this cake contained a bean and a pea, and whoever found either in their slice of cake was therefore automatically king and queen of, or Lord Misrule. Now, or king and queen. But yeah, it's a little bit unclear. Some people say that didn't happen. I found it actually in a 16th century primary source. So as a historian, in my books, that counts. But they might got it wrong in 1592. I don't know. But the bean cake was a kind of ginger cake, also sometimes known as pepper cake, and contained those beans and the pea. And we also know for sure that Sir William Peter of Ingerstone Hall in Essex, he entertained his guests on Twelfth Night in 1552 with such a specially baked spicy fruit cake that contained the bean and the pea, and therefore had the king and the queen of the revels, which were also known as the Lord of Misrule, depending on which source you're talking about.
Whilst they were Lord and Lady of Misrule, they were kind of in charge, weren't they? They outranked the king.
Yeah. They called the shots. Exactly. But just for that one day. So it was by default restricted before things could go awfully wrong.
So were there any Tudor games that were played at Christmas?
Right. Well, that's a good question. The one we all know about was obviously their habit of gaming. Lots of money was gained and lost by playing cards, but we also know that they had board games in that respect. Chess was another one that they loved playing at Christmas. Snakes and ladders is one that goes back to the Tudor age. There are a few board games that we still know and hopefully play at Christmas that would have been played. But there obviously was also dancing and music and whatever people preferred and what money could buy.
Are there any Tudor Christmas traditions that we still do today?
I would say in the vaguest sense, like obviously partying and eating more than we should. The one that comes to mind is obviously the giving of presents, of gifts. Now on the 25th, Christmas Day, well, during Tudor times, that was all happening on New Year's Day, obviously. And what I like about the Tudors, that they kept record of who gave what.
Oh, it's so handy, isn't it?
It's great.
It's so, because also it's a really good way. I was saying this to someone the other day. Looking at the gift rolls and everything is a really good way of knowing who's in and out of favour.
Yes, absolutely. And also because, especially when it came to food, you could get it awfully wrong. It was an art form. And to give the wrong food was highly offensive, which I think was quite funny, because there is also one case where, well, Elizabeth was extremely good in recording what she was given, by whom, and if she didn't like the look of it, she instantly regifted it to somebody else. And there's one case which just has me in stitches every single time I come across it, is that we know she had a sweet tooth. So she loved marchpane and marmalades and anything like that. But there's one case where somebody by the name of Hampton gave her marchpane and marmalade, but she instantly had it re-gifted to a Mrs. Skidmore. And it makes me wonder, what made her do that? Was it that this Hampton had a reputation of low quality produce, or, I just would love to know what made her a gifted. And in those roles of Christmas presents, that was added. And that's how we know it happened. But yeah, it's hilarious in my opinion.
Yeah. And Christmas gift giving is obviously hugely synonymous with Christmas today. As you said, gifts were given on New Year's Day in the Tudor period. Was gift giving, again, was it across the classes?
Yeah, very much so. Royalty and aristocracy obviously attracted luxury presents or luxury foods like game and expensive spices, foreign cheese. Anything foreign was always very welcome, and exotic, hard to come by new introductions, like, for instance, turkey. But food gifts were very common right throughout the Tudor period, and not necessarily just for Christmas or New Year's Day. It was a much practiced means of maintaining relationships, because we mustn't forget, not everybody was literate, but food gifts, the exchange of those helped to sustain a sense of community and respect across all levels of society. But we definitely do see a slight change in high status food gifts given between, let's say, Henry VII to his granddaughter, Elizabeth, where in the beginning we see clear bulks of meat and fish being gifted, and towards the close of the century, it's quite definitely noticeable that there's a change to also giving fresh and preserved fruit, but obviously also the sugar and sugar-based treats that came in with Elizabeth. Definitely.
But not potatoes.
No, definitely no potatoes in Tudor times.
I know it's your bugbear, isn't it?
It definitely is. But I can assure you there were no potatoes in Tudor England eaten by anybody. A handful of people who knew about the plants. John Gerard, for instance, we know grew some potato plants in his garden in London in 1597, but that was one of the first encounters of the potato plant. But not even he ate any of the potatoes because they died with the first frost, and he didn't know that you had to harvest them before. So definitely not Tudor times, no.
Well, there you go, folks. It's not potatoes were not a thing in Tudor England. So
Yes.
My final question for you then is there something from the way the Tudors did Christmas that you wish that we still did today?
Comes to mind is, and you probably will think, yeah, fasting before Christmas. It would do my body a lot better than gorging myself on Christmas feast even before Christmas. But I also, honestly, I do prefer the Tudor way of decorating the house on Christmas Eve, and not a day earlier.
Yeah, so you still hold to that now?
Yep, I do. I go into the garden on Christmas Eve with my garden shears, and I just go and find anything green.
So no tree in the Webster household?
No tree. Sometimes my husband sneaks in a Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, but not me. No.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming back on the podcast. This has been really fun. Do you want to briefly mention, because you've got your book, Eating with the Tudors, are you working on anything new?
Yeah, there's obviously my book that came out in 2023, Eating with the Tudors. And this summer, the paperback version has come out. And yeah, I am working currently on my second book. Can't tell you too much about it, but it will be all, it will in, yeah, plants and gardens. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming back on the podcast, and we'll hopefully speak again at some point soon.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Brilliant. And have a wonderful Christmas to you and Tom as well.
Thank you, and you. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Brigitte for coming back onto the podcast to tell us all about how the Tudors spent Christmas. Thank you very much for listening throughout 2025. This is the final episode of the year, as I am now going to be taking some time off to enjoy the Christmas holidays. The podcast will be returning in the first week of January. To all my listeners, I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and I will speak to you in 2026.